Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to the webinar on lessons learned in sovereign debt restructuring in Cyprus during 2012-13 crisis, presented by CFA Society Sri Lanka. This webinar is organized to draw lessons learned from the Cyprus economic crisis and discuss its applicability to Sri Lanka in the present context to overcome the prevailing economic crisis in Sri Lanka. We are joined today by an eminent panel of experts who have a wealth of experience and knowledge in working with other countries that have faced similar situations like our country. We are joined today by Dr. Taman Asanuma, who's an economist in the Strategy, Policy and Review Department of the International Monetary Fund. Since joining the fund in September 2010, he has spent most of his time in research and strategy and review department. During his time in the strategy review and policy department, he has contributed to series of the IMF policy papers on sovereign debt restructuring and IMF lending and sovereign bank linkages, involving many debt restructuring cases such as Greece, Myanmar, Belize, Cyprus, Grenada as an expert. He holds a PhD in economics from the Boston University, and his research interests are in macroeconomics, international finance, and public finance. He is particularly interested in sovereign debt and financial crisis and exchange rate regimes. He has published in several academic journals on this subject. Our serves as a technical assistant expert advisor at the International Monetary Fund and is a visiting scholar and professor at the Lebo College of Business, School of Economics in the Drexel University. He was a deputy division chief at the Debt and Capital Market Instruments, Monetary and Capital Markets Department of the International Monetary Fund until July 2017. While at the fund, he served as a special advisor to the governing board of the Bank of Greece and led numerous IMF missions on developing economic and financial policies for emerging market and developed economies, designed and implementing sovereign asset and liability management frameworks, developing local currency government bond market and instruments, and establishing and managing sovereign wealth funds. Prior to joining IMF, he was a senior vice president for international financial services and director of the foreign exchange services at WIFA Group and served as chief economist of the Council of Economic Advisors of Greece. He has also taught as adjunct associate professor of finance at Temple's Fox School of Business and was a principal research fellow at the University of Pennsylvania Department of Economics. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Pennsylvania and an MA in economics from Georgetown University. He is a research fellow at the University of Pennsylvania Department of Economics. He holds a PhD. He has published extensively in the area of international finance. Finally, but not last, our moderator this evening is Mr. Murtaza Jafferji. Murtaza is a past president of CFA Society Sri Lanka, the local member society of the CFA Institute, and also held the advocacy chair whose responsibilities included promoting good ethical practices in the capital market of Sri Lanka. He is an investment professional with over 25 years of industry experience. He has previously been a director of the Colombo Stock Exchange, Nations Trust Bank, and Serendip Hotels PLC. He is also the current chairman of Advocata Institute and the CEO of JB Securities. Murtaza holds a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering and computer science from the University of New South Wales, Australia, and a master's in financial economics from the University of Colombo. He is also a chartered financial analyst. Without further ado, let me pass on to Murtaza to take forward today's proceedings. Over to you, Murtaza.
Thank you, Dinesh. I think everybody can hear me clearly. This evening's session will go on from this point onwards for about 1.5 hours, no more than 2 hours. If there are a lot of questions coming in from our audience, we will perhaps have to exceed the defined 1.5 hours. How it will start is Michael and Tamon will first give us a presentation on the stated topic for the first 40 minutes. They have authored a paper on the same subject, and the presentation will cover this paper. And thereafter, I will try to draw parallels of what happened with Cyprus, with what is happening in Sri Lanka, and also take questions from the audience if there are any questions, and get our two speakers this evening to answer those questions. So without further ado, may I ask Michael to begin his presentation?
Thank you all for the invitation, and thank you for the comments, moderator. The presentation today, it's at a historic time for the country, for Sri Lanka, since is officially in default. And the presentation that we had prepared and we have prepared, the main thrust, it has to do with a country, Cyprus, that it has a different kind of a setup. But what we try to distinctly take out from this presentation, there are some similarities for all sovereign debt restructurings, noting at this point that every restructuring is different. And based on this kind of a presentation, we would like, excuse me, to give some broad outlines of what countries that they are entering in a restructuring, what are the causes, what are the processes, what are the outcomes, and what broadly can be expected from such an experience. And if we can use this experience for each, as mentioned, each individual case, in order to be going into a stable trajectory going forward after the restructuring, after the default, and also build the foundations for growth of the economy, that we find that this is the main pillar for countries avoiding distressed situations and cases of need of restructurings and defaults. Now, with these introductory remarks, I am going to be passing it to Tamon in order to be starting the presentation. And after he is going to be giving the macroeconomic setting for the country that we are analyzing for Cyprus, then I'm going to be taking the next part of the presentation that is going to be mainly focusing on a constituent part of the Cyprus case, that it was the banking crisis. Now, with these brief remarks, I am turning it over to Tamon. Tamon, please.
Hello, sorry, can you hear me? Sorry, would you be okay to upload slides from my side? Would it be okay? Or shall we wait until sharing the slide from your side?
We can see the slides at the moment on the screen, so please go ahead, Tomon.
Okay. Okay. So it would be grateful if you could just, if you could share the slides from our side. So our presentation is actually focused on the banking crisis, sovereign debt restructuring, and financial stabilities in Cyprus during the 2012 and 13. Okay. So this is a presentation is actually built on a paper written by myself and also Michael, as well as another co-author, Takahiro Tsuda, which is published in one of the journal in the papers. Okay, we'll be happy to share the papers as well if you're interested in. Okay, so let me just quickly go into the contents of presentation. Sorry, one important remarks. Usual remarks applies. The view expressed in this sort of a presentation is actually based on ours. Nothing to do with the institution which I work, International Monetary Fund, and its executive board and some management. Okay, so let me move on to the contents of presentation. So we start from the backgrounds of the presentation,
Amon, if I can interrupt, can you just put it on full screen? Go on the bottom right hand side, and you have like a screen icon, bottom right hand, and click on that.
Sorry, maybe
you can go to slideshow. Slideshow on the top.
Oh, sorry, give on a second. Okay. Can you see? Okay, would that be okay?
I think you're having two monitors. Yeah, you just take user presenter view, remove that. Use presenter view, unclick that. The top right hand side, just below automatic.
Which
where
one?
it says monitors. Okay, it doesn't matter for the moment. Keep going the way it is.
Sorry, can you go on? Sorry, is it okay? Is there any
no.
problem that people can see? Sorry,
Yeah.
it's very hard to change from the Zoom.
Doesn't matter. Keep going.
Okay. Sorry about the technical issues. Okay, so may I just simply go on? Again, so this presentation is actually based on banking sector crisis, sovereign debt destruction, and financial stability policies in Cyprus during 2012 and 13, and it's based on the papers published in one of the articles together with my another co-author, Takahiro Tsuda. Okay. Again, so usual remarks surprise. The view expressed in these papers, nothing to do with ourselves, the institution which I work, International Monetary Fund, executive board, its management. Okay, so let me go into the contents. So here's going to be the sort of our discussions in going forward. So we start from the background of the papers and discuss about the prevailing macro setting, and also discuss the Cyprus domestic debt restructuring in 2013 and domestic bond restructuring terms and banking crisis and the financial stability policies and outcomes of the restructuring and the lesson we learned from the Cyprus experience. Okay, so let me just quickly go over the background of the papers. So I just briefly mentioned before, this presentation is actually based on the published papers that examine the causes, policies, outcomes of the recent Cyprus banking crisis and the main domestic debt restructuring, which is Astonuma, Papagiannou, and Tsuda, 2012, that's published in Multinational Finance Journal. Okay, we'll be happy to share the paper if you're interested in. So brief overview of the paper is actually, the papers actually shed some lights on the macroeconomic settings surrounding the episodes, analyze and institute policies, and assess the implication to the Cyprus economy. Okay. In this context, our sort of investigations intended to inform the relevant public debates and facilitates a broad discussions of related policies, especially for domestic debt restructuring. Okay, so let me start from prevailing macro setting, which is going to be the first topics. Okay, so what really happened before the Cyprus actually entering the banking crisis / domestic debt restructuring? What happened was the government cash reserves were enough to cover only 2 and 3 months of the financing requirement. So countries actually have, the government has really the cash shortage, and countries has lost the market access about 2 years until 2013. Okay, so real economy was deep recessions where the employment has been risen to unprecedented levels and relatively large financials and external balances and deficit. Okay, well, what drive this sort of oscillations was driven by so many factors that go in the macroeconomic factors underlying this. One was unsustainable credit expansions in the previous decades, resulting in property bubbles that happened in Cyprus. And also the interesting thing was there's a cross financial link with Greece, both in terms of bank loans to the residents and holding of GGB bonds, which is the Greek government bonds. Then what really happened in Greece in 2012, 11 or 12 was Greek experiences a sovereign debt crisis and the experience of debt restructuring, which is completed in March 2012. And at the same time, there was extremely high recapitalization needs of the Cyprus banks. At the same time, there was an unsustainable cost of public finance due to lax fiscal policies. As a result, government actually requested financial assistance from the European Stability Mechanism, an IMF, in June 2004. So this is actually showing both the Cyprus primary balance and the public debt around this period. So in terms of primary deficit, we clearly see the significant drops happening in 2009, which primary balance deteriorated significantly to minus 5.4%. Then it actually used a huge deficit over the 3 years until 2013, until the reform has been placed. So this is actually the one of the biggest reason, which is we have significant expenditures that are happening on the fiscal side, which is actually turning to a huge surge in debt, as we see, because public debt increased dramatically from 44% of GDP to reach 103% of GDP in 2013. So this is exactly what happened in Cyprus in terms of loose fiscal policies that we actually see. Okay, so let me turn it back to Michael to discuss about the Cyprus domestic debt restructuring. Sorry, before that, I'm just simply talk about the Cyprus domestic restructuring in 2013. Okay, so one of the things is restructuring was undertaken in a context of countries' economic adjustment programs and restored debt sustainabilities. Agree with two financing. One is going to be Euro Stability Mechanism, which is approved in March 25, 2013, of amount euro about 9.0 billion euro, and also International Monetary Fund, which is approved in March 2013, which is extended fund facilities. The resource was about 1.0 billion euros. Okay. Both program was concluded successfully as schedules at end March 2016, and the governments agreed to restructure or roll over 1.0 billion domestic bonds maturing within the program period, which is 2013's second quarter to the first quarter 2016. Okay? And domestic debt actually stood at the euros of 15.5 billion at 2012 level, which is around 80% of GDP, and about 60% was held domestic institution, mostly by the private bank. Okay. So the government also implements a number of upfront and front consolidation measures, mostly on the expenditure side. Okay. So let me quickly go over the restructuring terms. So there are 5 new euro-denominated bonds, which is amounts 1.0 billion for issues at the time as exchange with existing bonds. There was no principal haircut, which means there's no reductions in nominal value of the debt. Maturity extensions by average of 6.3 years, which is maturing spanning to 2019 to 23. Okay, so there was no coupon rate reduction, so they keep the original terms of coupon rate as it was before, and fixed annual interest rate structure was 4.5 to 6 on average. Okay? So if you calculate net present value haircut based on Suzune's Detomayer 2018 approach, net present value haircut was about 36% on average using exit yields of each particular instruments. Okay. So there was no use of CACs or no exit consent. Restructured domestic debt was issued under the Cyprus law before the EU CACs model enacted in January 2016. Okay. So the authority achieved 100% participation rates in debt exchange of eligible bonds, which means all the eligible debt was exchanged at the time of the debt restructuring. So this tables actually summarize the key features of domestic debt restructuring. As I explained this before, so there are 11 instruments exchanged with 5 new instruments. Okay. So face value of the bonds remains unchanged between all instruments and new instruments. So that corresponds to no nominal haircut. Okay. And maturity was extended to about 5.3 years, which is originally remaining maturity of all bonds was between 0 and 2.7 years, has now extended to 6 and 10 years after the exchange. Okay. Coupon rate remains unchanged with the same coupon rate as specifies in. Reprofiling is actually at the so-called bullet type. This is actually due to the maturities. Okay. And so when you calculate a net present value of the bonds, which is actually showing all bonds is going to correspond to 100.9%. With the new instruments, it's going to 64.9. Okay. Net present value haircut is going to be around 36% with using exit yields of the corresponding instruments. Okay. If you look at the market interest rate, which is slightly different from what Suzune's use, which is actually divided by face value of the debt, which is going to correspond to 35%. Okay, this is going to be. So if you're going to look at the exchange recovery rate, which is defined by Astonuma, Niepels, and Latsier, which is the recent measures that corresponds to the market value of the debt, which is the recovery rates about the 84% corresponds to exchange haircut of about 16%. Okay, so let me quickly, one of the features of the Cyprus debt exchange was due to the exchange, the bonds, which is remaining maturities is actually short, ended up with larger haircut. So technically mean creditors holding the short-term bonds suffered larger haircuts. So if this actually chart is showing SZ recovery rates, so 1 minus SZ recovery rates are going to correspond to haircut. Okay, so which means the bonds with remaining maturity almost like a 0 is going to correspond to large SZ recovery, SZ haircut, but small SZ recovery rates. In contrast, the bonds with long remaining maturities, about 3 years, is going to obtain larger SZ recovery rates, which is going to be smaller SZ haircut. Okay, so technically there is sort of a difference in net present value haircut, which is the creditors actually receiving. The bonds with the short maturity bonds suffer more than the long-term. Okay, as a result of exchange, what really happened here, the cash service has changed dramatically. So this chart is actually comparing the debt service with all bonds and the exchange debt. Okay, exchange debt is shown in orange, all debt is shown in blue. So query, there was big debt service due in 2013 second quarter, okay, which was shifted almost to the left. And we clearly see that that service was not following any of the period from the particularly on the program period. It has extended or stretched over the longer period, over the 6 to 10 years, as we could see. Okay, so let me turn it to Michael to discuss about the banking crisis.
Thank you, Tamon. It's crisis, it's sovereign debt restructuring that we have seen. It has its own issues and also its idiosyncrasies. And in the case of Cyprus, we had seen, along with whatever it was happening in the fiscal field, we had a brewing banking crisis. So along the side of the fiscal consolidation policies that Tamon was discussing, we had the IMF programs and the European partners programs that they required the banking sector restructuring and recapitalization. And within kind of a framework, the programs, they were looking for a prudent risk-based approach to lending, because what we had seen before, and as the numbers that Tamon showed, that the banks, they had been grown in a not prudent way in terms of their lending policies and in terms also of their portfolios and their balance sheets, the asset side of their balance sheets. Now, the measures for the banking crisis that primarily they were looking for a restructuring, they involved the second largest bank, the Cyprus Popular Bank, to be closed because it was not having enough capital to survive. Now, along with this kind of consolidation, if you want, in the banking sector, the programs, they proposed and they enacted a unique bail-in mechanism, which was an one-time bank deposit haircut that the money from this haircut, they were used to cover the cost of bank recapitalization. And this is important in order to be saying a few words here. Whenever you are going to be having a restructuring, and especially if the restructuring involves the domestic sector, the most important component of the designing of the programs is to see what are the implications of such restructuring on the domestic financial system, in particularly banks. And this aspect, it involves, in case that the restructuring, it affects the capital structure of the commercial banks, that adequate measures, they are going to be envisioned for the recapitalizations of the commercial banking sector. But in some cases also, when we have big exposure of the central bank to domestic sovereign debt, also we may have a need for recapitalization of the central bank. So these are the comments in regards to what we have discussed about the restructuring and the recapitalization aspects of the banking crisis. Now, I mentioned the bail-in mechanism, and this is a unique mechanism. As we said that most sovereign debt restructurings, they have common themes, but also they have unique features. And in the case of Cyprus, the unique feature, it was the exposure of the commercial banks, and that's why in the programs that they were designed for the resolution of the crisis, they involved this bail-in mechanism. And this bail-in mechanism, that it was basically the haircut, it was imposed on the uninsured deposits of this bank that it was closed, the second largest bank, the Cyprus Popular Bank. And also this levy, it was imposed on 47.5% of the uninsured deposits of the largest commercial bank, the Bank of Cyprus. Now, it is important to note that no insured deposits of euros of 100,000 or less were affected. Again, a specific feature because of the status of Cyprus as a Euro member. This is covered by the ECB rules. Now, the importance of these measures for the restructuring and the recapitalization is the impact that we had and the impact on the banking sector. It was effective, and in the process we had also some other consolidation the consolidation elements in the banking restructuring. We had a cooperative bank that it was resolved, and also along with the issues that we had with the closing of the second business of the second largest bank, and also the resolution of the cooperative bank, we had the issue of the bad assets of these institutions, and this was needed to be taken care of. And in this kind of a situation, what it was proposed, it was an asset management company that acquired all the bad loans. Now, the NPLs, after what we saw with this kind of a restructuring and the recapitalization, the NPL, the non-performing loans, they declined significantly in both absolute and also the percentage terms. And we are going to be discussing a few more things in the next slide. Next slide, Tamon, please. Now, whenever we are talking about a banking crisis, always we are thinking about the situation in terms of the financial stability aspects. And what Tamon discussed earlier about the fiscal consolidation measures that they were needed, this is the part of the fiscal sustainability aspects that we are having in programs and also in proposals for resolving a crisis situation. So we have the fiscal sustainability and we have the financial stability also policies that they are needed, and they are essential elements in most programs that they are dealing with restructurings. Let me go in some detail that I am going to be using as background for what we are going to be discussing later on for the Sri Lankan case. Now, as we all know, and this is in most of the cases that we have observed of restructuring, sovereign debt restructuring, whenever we have weaknesses in the banking sector, the first sector that is affected, mostly from the policies, the lending policies of the commercial banks, is the real sector. And effectively, if the real sector is going to be impacted, the consequence of that is that we are going to be having less income. Therefore, the fiscal accounts, they are going to be affected. And then we are going to be having possible problems of debt sustainability. So you see a cycle, a vicious cycle, that whenever we have the banking sector suffering, the economy it suffers, then because of the economy suffering, you're having the fiscal situation and also the possibilities of debt distress, possibilities with high probability. Now, in the case of Cyprus, at the end of 2011, we had the NPLs reaching 10% of the total bank lending portfolio, while at the end of June 2011, the Cyprus banks holdings, they had exposures both to Greek loans that they amounted to 130% of GDP, and also Greek government bonds in the order of 40% of GDP. Now, by any standards that what we have seen in other restructurings, these exposures of the banks, both to an economy, the Greek economy, that it was having severe problems because of the Greek debt crisis, and also because of the exposure in the asset side of the banks of having 40% of GDP in terms of Greek government bonds. These were regulatory aspects that they had been overlooked when the situations they were considered normal. So this is a first kind of a point that I would like to make in terms of the fiscal aspects that they were running a little bit lax in the case of Cyprus, but also at the same time, we had overlooked the financial stability aspects from the point of view of the central bank in relation to the lending and also the structure of banks, that it created immense problems when the crisis started and when the Cyprus authorities, they needed to be addressing the issues. Now, given these exposures, the Greek private sector involvement in March 2012, and this is the PSI, as it's called, private sector involvement, is the exchange of the restructured bonds, which is basically the restructuring of the debt. This Greek situation eroded the confidence in Cyprus banks because of the exposure of the Cyprus banks into Greece, both in terms of loans, but also in terms of the assets of the banks. And this, it triggered, oh, beautiful. And this, it triggered the bursting of the asset bubble. And what we saw in this kind of a case, it was that the banking sector, it was considered that it needed significant adjustment. And the first adjustment that always we see is that the central bank in this kind of cases provides liquidity. And in this case, the Central Bank of Cyprus provided emergency liquidity. It's called ELA, Emergency Liquidity Assistance, for the banks that we said that the second largest and also the largest bank, in order to be saving the banks to the extent possible. And this is the first kind of defense that the central banks are doing in case that their banking system, it suffers. They are looking at their systemic banks, the biggest 2-3 banks, in order to be taking measures, if it's possible, with some kind of emergency liquidity in order to be taking them out from any kind of insolvency, if possible. And this is also a measure that the central banks, they are using in order to be restoring somehow the confidence of the public, so the public is not having bank runs on their deposits. But in this kind of case, the Cyprus case, even though we had the liquidity assistance, these banks, they experienced deposit outflows, and that eventually they were declared insolvent in March 2013. The situation that it was faced at that time it was that the restructuring of the banks, it was taken in the programs in a very serious way, because some of the stability policies that they needed, they may had some implications for the actual restructuring of the public sector and also the government debt. And especially since the restructuring, it pertained only to the domestic sovereign debt. Now, this kind of a loop that we have in, and this is something that mentioned earlier, but also we would like to bring further, is important in order to be understanding the synergies between the fiscal and also the financial aspects of the economy, and how these kind of two aspects, they are interlinked in order to be taking the situation in an effective way forward when they are designing the programs for the resolution of the debt. Now, let's go to the next slide and discuss some of the outcomes. Having mentioned the issues of the restructuring and how also we dealt with the banking crisis in order to be restoring the confidence in the financial sector, especially the banking sector. Now, we would like to be making some kind of comments of what we consider in this kind of a case successful restructuring, and give the sense of how we determine successful, because the essence of what is successful, it depends on what criteria we are setting for ourselves in order to be saying that an outcome, and in this kind of a case, a debt restructuring outcome is successful. And the criteria here that we are having is whether the restructuring it succeeded in acquiring substantial debt relief in order to be reducing the country's, Cyprus, debt to GDP ratio. So the first thing, it was to have a broad kind of a criterion, a broad measure of fiscal stability, and that it was the debt to GDP ratio. As we have seen in most cases, this is used as an indicator, and the credit rating agencies, they are using it. So the restructuring, it succeeded a substantial relief, and it reduced the debt to GDP ratio. So from that point of view, it is considered successful. The second one, as we said, the fiscal situation, it was distorted by the banking crisis, and whatever it was implemented with the consolidation of the banking sector and the levy, the haircut that we had in deposits. These were successful in restoring financial stability, and this is the other criterion that we are using in order to be saying that the debt restructuring in the case of Cyprus was successful. Now, based on these general remarks, every kind of a restructuring, it has its own metrics of how we are determining the success of a restructuring. But in this kind of cases, these are very generic, very general. The debt sustainability and also the financial stability, they were intended in order to be addressed by the programs, and they were succeeded. Now, of course, in order to be going in this kind of direction and have these successes, there are costs. And every restructuring, every restructuring that we have seen, it has its costs. And the costs, they may be in terms of higher unemployment, because the consolidation, the fiscal consolidation measures, they may be affecting the government sector. They may be affecting subsidies. They may be affecting the way that some of the operations in the government sector are done, and some of the public employees, including of entities that they are guaranteed by the state, they may be affected. So employment, it may be reduced. And this is one of the costs that we are facing in most of the restructuring cases, when we have a significant element of the restructuring, the fiscal consolidation measures. The other thing is that we are going to be, in all cases, because we need to be having more surpluses in order to be reducing the debt to GDP, then in these cases we have the tax system that it is also affected, more taxes that they are coming to the whole public. Now, in the case also of Greece, the biggest effect, the biggest cost, it was for depositors. And the bail-in of both the resident and non-resident depositors, it helped to mitigate the burden of high bank recapitalization for the general public, because the haircut, it saved some money for the banks in order to be used for the recapitalization. Then this meant that the budget and the public sector did not have to provide the money that it was needed for the recapitalization of the banks. Of course, somebody had to pay, and the cost, it was shared by the depositors. So this is the first cost that we see over and above what we see in cases of employment, and also taxation, and also curtailment of expenditures of countries when they are going in the restructures. In this kind of a case, one major cost, it was the cut in the deposits that we discussed earlier in the banking system. Now, by having this kind of a restructuring, the economy recovered very quickly relatively to the other cases that we have seen in similar restructuring, and it had an increase, a positive growth, and also a fiscal performance that it was within 2 years after the restructuring that we had, and that it was also followed by credit rating. The credit rating agencies, they compensated this quick, if I may say, and effective restructuring in Cyprus, that it was showing the results with the economy recovering. The credit ratings returned to investment grade very quickly within the second year. And also we saw that the market access, that it had been lost, that it was restored in a very short period of time. They had the first issuances in March of 2014, which is about a year after the completion. Now, let's go to the last 2 slides, and let's see if we can draw some kind of lessons that we can discuss also later on with applications in the case of Sri Lanka. Now, the presentation today, as we said also all along this talk, it has, first of all, to hear from all the participants the views that they had from what they heard about the case of Cyprus. What do they consider as policies that they were right or they were not right, and why in the case of Cyprus, and how these kind of policies they may be translated in the case of Sri Lanka. So this is something that we would like also to discuss with all the participants in the questions and answers section. Now, the second objective of the presentation is some to derive some broad lessons from the case of Cyprus for countries that they are in similar situations. And this is a situation, as we said, it's unique, but nonetheless, it has some kind of general aspects that it is useful in order to be having in mind also in the case of Sri Lanka. And to have a view of what to expect and what not to expect, and what are the good policies, the good kind of strategies in order to be doing and in order to be dealing with as we go in similar situations. What is the strategies that they need to be followed, not to be followed, and what to expect going forward. Now, from the Cyprus experience, the important lessons, I think, that we think that they are of importance to mention is that to see the causes. And as we said that in every sovereign debt restructuring, and these are for lessons also for the future, is the cause of the 2013 restructuring of the domestic sovereign debt. It was the excessive fiscal deficit and the accumulation of the high debt levels over a prolonged period of time. And this is something, the words have been chosen carefully here in order to be saying about excessive fiscal deficits, accumulation of debt, and also long period of time. And this is also what is looked by credit rating agencies in order to be evaluated a country when it goes out and asks for ratings that they are going to be using for borrowing. So this is lesson number one that we have seen in most cases that we have dealt with debt restructurings, and is also the case here of Cyprus. Authorities, they have to be very mindful of the fiscal deficits, and also they have to be very mindful of what is the debt to GDP ratio as they go forward with new borrowing, and for how long this kind of the accumulation of debt it can be sustained. Now, the other lesson that we have from the Cyprus case is the financial crisis. And the financial crisis in particular, it touched the commercial banks in Cyprus. And this is a lesson that the central banks, that they are in positions that the commercial banks, they are going into unchecked lending, and also in not prudent from the risk management perspective of their portfolios, of their balance sheets, in terms of their assets and of course in terms of their liabilities. It is something that the central banks always, they should keep in mind in order not to let the situation becoming a grave situation, because in the event of some kind of a shock, external shock, internal shock, then the banking sector, it is going to be vulnerable and it is going to be creating more trouble for resolving the situations. And we said in the Cypriot cases, the Greek exposure, it was something that it was overlooked, and the managers that we had from the Cypriot banks, in order to be also careful when the Greek situation and their exposure to the Greek situation, in order to be reducing their exposure to the Greek economy, both in terms of loans, but also in terms of acquiring Greek government bonds, they did not do that. When the German banks and the French banks, they were unloading Greek government bonds at, of course, a discount, they thought, the Cypriot bankers, that it was an opportunity for them to increase the exposure, overlooking what it was, the risk that they were undertaking in their portfolios. Risk management course 101, that it was overlooked, but also the central bank, it was not at the position in order to be going into this kind of a direction, and also enforcing the prudent capital measures that they were required from the ECB and also from Basel. So let me stop here and turn it back to Murtaza and start the conversation.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Tamon. I think if there are other questions that come in from the audience, I'm happy to take it up. There is a chat window, so the CFA staff will perhaps put them across to us. If I was to start first with getting some clarification, because all our audience may not be familiar with all the terminology, if I can ask you, Tamon, on slide number 10, you showed the payment profile of the existing debt prior to the restructuring and then the subsequent debt. If you're able to put that up again on the screen, slide number 10. Yeah. So if you go to slide number 10, the first question I was quite curious is that there seems to be a very large bullet payment, the orange one. Now, when you have a need to reprofile, and in terms of debt sustainability, why did this happen, that you had this very large bullet payment happening?
All right, Mr. Thank you so much for questions. So let me clarify. So I think the blue bar is actually showing all debt, which was originally to repay. Okay, after the restructuring, the payment has stretched over from 2014 to 2023, which is shown in orange bar. Okay, so still there is a bullet payments needs to be done in 2019 or second quarter, so second half. This is due to the fact of extending the bond, which is the payments was due in the second half of 2013, by extending 6 years. So that was why. But important thing is over the horizon from 2013 second half to the first half of 2016, there was only interest payments needs to be done. So only a small amounts of payments to be paid. So there's substantial debt service relief over the horizons for the 3 years. That corresponds to the program period.
Okay.
Hope that will clarify the question.
All right. So what I was curious is that whether they would have staggered the cash flows. It looks like they have a large principal payments. The smaller bar seem to be interest payments, and the larger bar seems to be principal payments. That why they didn't break it into smaller principal payments to stagger the cash flows. Can I probably go back to another question because it's very relevant to Sri Lanka? Now here you have only done a reprofiling, which means that the principal and coupon payments have remained the same, but you have extended the maturities by something like 5 years. But we see that there is a significant reduction in the NPV. And the reduction in the NPV, maybe you can go to slide number 8, that you show a significant reduction in the NPVs. So our audience today would have a lay audience, but large, perhaps CFA members also who would be familiar with the basic NPV computation. Now this exit yield, can you help us understand what this exit yield is? Because you know what the bonds are yielding relative to what the secondary market is trading at, but there seems to be a difference in the exit yield after the restructuring. So can you explain to us the concept of the exit yield?
Okay, Mustafa, thank you so much for the question. So exit yield is going to be corresponds to the yield of the news bonds that first traded at the market.
Right.
So let's say in this case of Cyprus, the exit yield, which was the yields, which is exit corresponds, was about 12. I think it was 4%. I think exit yield was. I think we draw here. Exit yield was 12.5% to 13.2%. Okay, so that was the range of exit yields at the time of the exchange. So that's going to correspond to the yield which is traded at the time when these bonds are issued.
Okay, so in most cases there is an issuer and there is an investor. So the issuer is basically concerned about the timing of his repayments and the magnitude of the cash flows. But the investors are really looking at what kind of impact it is going to make to the NPV. So, you know, the exit yield basically, I mean, if you are an investor, you will try to basically use as high as possible exit yield, basically in a negotiation process with the credit, with the issuer, saying that, look, you know, I am taking an excessively high NPV hit. So who determines this exit yield? Is it the same yield that the bonds traded before the restructuring, or is it something that happens on the first day that it trades?
So this is going to correspond to the latter. It's going to be the first day of the traded yield. Okay, so this actually reflects the creditors' expectations where the news bonds will be paying terms, or the expected additional default likely to happen down the road. Okay, that will capture.
So generally the exit yield basically prior to the restructuring and after the restructuring, the first day that, so what happens is that the old bonds get exchanged for new bonds, right? That's what happens. Most restructuring, the old bonds go away and a whole bunch of new bonds are issued.
Right. So I think depending on the methodology and how we're going to calculate. So what the Schwarzenegger-Zettelmeyer's 2018 actually proposed is use the exit yield of the new instruments, which is going to correspond to the yield of the bonds, which is newly issued at the market, which is going to first issuance. You're going to take the yield to calculate the present value of all bonds and new bonds respectively, right? Okay, so what the alternative measures, which is proposed, is going to be what exactly, which is going to call exchange recovery rate, so exchange haircut, which is Astronoman, Niepels, and Nancy actually proposed, is why don't you use the yield of bonds for both old and the new to evaluate respectively the old NPV and the new NPV. So this is going to correspond to the market values. Okay, so if you evaluate with the same with that approach, the net present, what we call the market haircut exchange haircut, its size is smaller. It's about like 16%. So that's going to correspond to the difference that you can imagine. Hope that will clarify the question.
Yeah. Okay. If I can move on, going back to, maybe we can take some questions that have come in. Right. So we talked about fiscal consolidation and having, maybe I can put this question to Michael, that, or maybe Tamon, your paper basically talked about the fiscal consolidation measures. And in the case of Cyprus, most of the focus was on the expenditure side, right? Am I correct? And perhaps less on the revenue side. So what were the measures that were taken?
Michael, should I take the questions or?
Yeah, yes, please.
Yeah. So, Mr. Thanks so much for questions. I think, sorry, we didn't have a time to clarify this point because we were more focused on the banking, sort of the crisis part. But I think what really happening, what's the cause of the large fiscal deficit over the horizon for 2009, 2013 was expenditures. Okay. So the larger the measures, well, we actually showed like, so the measures actually taken for the reform was on the expenditure side. Okay. But at the same time, there's partial, like, small amounts of the revenue measures also taken at the same time in the program design. Hope that will clarify. Okay.
Maybe I can ask a follow-up question because we have a Sri Lankan audience here. As we discussed yesterday prior to today that Sri Lanka has been 16 times to the IMF before. Now, Michael, you have been in the fund for many decades and you've been perhaps in many programs. Even Tamon would have seen a lot of programs. In most countries, is it more to do with the revenue side or is it on the expenditure side? The fiscal consolidation, where does the problem lie in most countries?
Okay, let me start and then Tamon will come in. The first thing that we would like to point out is that in most cases, especially the most prominent cases of restructuring, the problem with distressed debt, it has come because of large expenditures. But also, this is an issue that we see at probably at similar instances of having low revenues, and in particular, the tax system. The tax system, in some cases, because of reasons that they are politically motivated, they have been kept at a very low level, that they are creating the big issues with the deficit. Now, in the case of Greece, for instance, the important thing was that you had both the expenditures going out of control, but also at the same time that the taxes, they were not following up with the higher incomes. The progressivity, it was not there, that it was needed. And in other cases, we have seen that also the countries that they face more frequently problems with debt distress, they are having issues with both the composition of the expenditure side, but also on the revenue side. But the current situation that we are facing in many restructurings is that we see also that some countries, they are deficient in terms of tax collections, revenue collections, in particular after what we have seen with the situation with COVID. And this is something that we have been alerted, and the IMF, it has also tried in order to be saying that after we have some sort of renormalization of the situation, we should not forget, in order to be getting the appropriate tax revenues that they are needed. Otherwise, we are going to be ending up in deficits and also in debt problems.
Tamon, you can stop sharing the screen so that the images, the videos will come out clearly. Okay, while he's doing that, there are some other questions pertaining to the Cyprus case. The question is, would this possibly result in restructured foreign currency debt holders having to take a much larger haircut than what they would have if the haircuts were taken across all government debt? So somewhere in your paper, basically, you talked about most of the burden was on non-residents. And, you know, if I remember correctly, I believe that Cyprus had a lot of Russian money in the banking system. And this unique way where they got a bail-in and where you exempted $100,000, anything less than 100,000 euros were exempted, and the uninsured deposits are the ones that did go in with a haircut. Was that in any way influenced due to the nature of the residency of the depositors?
The answer to that is that the structure of what kind of a level it is going to be used in order to be going after the bail-in mechanism, it was dictated by what it was coming from ECB. So this was the 100,000. But I can share something with you that in the beginning, even though we had from the ECB this clear rule that you cannot impose any kind of a haircut on deposits in any European, in any Euro country below 100,000, basically they were secured. In the first designs of the program, they instituted in order to be going with a haircut even with less 100,000. And that created a big kind of an issue. It came to the EU, to the ECB, and finally they went back to the 100. So this is for history. Now, the second issue that you asked me is if the residency of the depositors, it played a role. Now, it happened that the depositors, and you mentioned the Russians, they were concentrating on the two biggest banks. And that's why the risk adjusted kind of measures that we are using from Basel, in case that you are going to be having some kind of a risk, the concentration of the depositors, it played a role. And that's why, because of all of this money that they were going into, especially to the second largest bank, that it suffered the most, closure and also the levy, it was investing in instruments that they were riskier. They were the Greek loans and also the assets. And that's why, with simple, from what we know, from the simple risk measures that they were taking, the stress testing that they were doing, it was showing that these banks, they needed in order to be restructured. Now, these banks, it happened to be having the largest concentration of foreign depositors, and also in particular Russian depositors. So this is the background that it has come out. And there were not only the Russians, there were also some from the Middle East that they had deposited. There were some from Asia that they had deposited in these banks, because these banks, they were, because of the lending practices that they had, and also the exposures, the Greek debt, it was giving higher yields. they were able, in order to be given higher deposit rates. And that's what it had attracted a number of investors from all over the world. It was approximately 40%, 44% of Russian, but the rest of it, it was about 20, 25% of some in the area, and the other, the remaining about 30, 40%, it was from all over the world. But
So-
the main essence, it was stress tested, that it was determining what it needed to be having this kind of a level.
So maybe I can pivot to get you to think about Sri Lanka's problem. I mean, our debt to GDP probably is heading close to 110% of GDP this year, because we have had a large depreciation in the currency. And of our domestic currency debt, over 40% is being held by the banks, and our central bank holds about 17%. And then we have an external debt, out of which we have these Euro bonds, which comprises about 1/3 of the total outstanding, of which these Euro bonds are domestic banks own 15%. And it was funny that you mentioned that when the Greek and when the German and French banks were selling, the Cypriot banks were buying, although they thought that they were buying at a discount. Incidentally, when international investors were selling our Euro bonds in 2020, once COVID hit us, it was a domestic banks who doubled their exposure to Euro bonds. And they were kind of, I'm told that policymakers gave them an assurance that Sri Lanka will continue to honor these instruments. But I think that turned out to be a very empty promise. So coming back to Sri Lanka, we have about 20% of our banking assets in dollar-based assets, perhaps mainly lent to residents. The offshore banking may be a smaller component. And on the liability side, 20% of the liabilities are also non-domestic currency liability. Now, I gave an example of what the exposure of banks are to the sovereign. Over 40% of the domestic debt securities are owned by the banks, and about 15% of these Euro bonds, which comprise about 1/3 of the external debt. But it probably is about 50% of the debt that's going to be restructured. Now, this concept of bail-in, the first time I heard about bail-in was Cyprus, I think, in the sovereign debt crisis. Tamon and Michael, can you kind of give us the thinking? Of course, you all wrote a paper on Cyprus. Has bail-ins on sovereign debt crises happened in any other countries? And do you see that happening in a country like Sri Lanka, that now is under the Basel III framework? And we do have tier 2 debt, contingent convertibles. So how should we think about it? You know, the first line of defense is equity, second line of defense is the tier 2, and the third line is obviously a bail-in. So I'd like to have your comments on that.
Mon, would you like to start?
Oh, okay, Michael, thanks. So Mr. thanks so much for the question. So I think Cyprus case is very unique in a case that they actually did a bail-in. Technically, depositors actually suffer the credit losses, right? Technically, you know, the domestic restructuring has happened, and also the domestic residents suffer the losses, which is going to be, you know, depositors of the bank. Okay. Alternative case that you're actually considering, a case of domestic debt restructuring, we can call, is going to be Jamaica, 2012, 2010, and 2013. So what happened was, Jamaica case, there was not a bail-in. However, there was capital injections by the government, okay, which is come with the taxpayers' money. So alternatively, this is not a bail-in as we discussed, which is Michael explained, which is going to be directly the depositors actually get suffered. However, it's also paying the money by, you know, the taxpayers' money going in the after the fiscal consolidations in the later years. So in alternative way, there is a separate way to sort of, you know, provide the money from the government to the bank in order to suffer these losses of the domestic restructuring. So but Michael can complement any further thoughts on it. So it technically varies across the episodes, how we're going to do it, and also at the same time, what exactly the fiscal balance of the government is likely to be. In the Cyprus case, it was very unique because they did a bail-in, because the government also have a fiscal storage deficit. They have to do a consolidation measure as well. So that's why there's a limited scope for further, capital injection the government can take. So they actually they took the approach of bail-in. Then it seems to be successful because countries actually regain market access relatively quickly, and the government can tap the domestic market relatively quickly within 2-3 years. So alternative way is going to be, as explained, is going to be the capital injections, which is come with the taxpayers' money. So that could be alternative way that is apply, and actually apply in the Jamaica case. Sorry, let me also have Michael to chip in and complement one of my thoughts.
Yeah, Tamon, exactly right. The issues for every case are different. For Sri Lanka are, of course, a different situation. And we would like to say that this situation, it needs to be assessed by the government, as we mentioned also. In this situation, you need to be having a good government counterpart. And government, I mean not only the central government, but also it should be the representatives from the central bank and from the other entities that they are the monetary policy authorities, that they need to be assessing the situation and to work together with the IMF that it has been called at the moment for the situation. It is important always to have a good local team that it assesses the situation. And this, it should be the feedback that it is going to go to any program that it is going to be discussed with the government in order to be taking the country out of this stress and also this crisis. And the IMF, we do not know how it is going to be assessing the situation at the moment in relation to the crisis. And it is going to be always a case that they are going to be looking based on what are the initial conditions, but also what are the dynamics, what are the assumptions for going forward. And based on this kind of a situation, along what it is needed in the fiscal side, in the fiscal sector, they are going to be needed what is the appropriate measures that they need to be discussed with the authorities in relation to the banking sector, given the exposures that you gave. So this is the comments that I would like to share. And to summarize, first, the country needs to put a team together in order to be discussing both the fiscal and also the banking situation, to understand the issues, to clarify the issues for themselves, and also to have objectives. And this kind of a situation, it needs to be communicated with the IMF in order to understand also from the IMF that they are bringing the international experience, that they are bringing to the table all of the policies that the IMF, it has been used in other countries, and what it has worked, what doesn't have worked, in order to becoming for an effective program. That's what it is needed. But this is something that it is something that it is very difficult for us in order to be saying which way the program it is going to be looking at the potential. I don't want to say a potential banking crisis in Sri Lanka.
Maybe I can ask a slightly different question to help our audience think through this problem. Now, the way our debt is in local currency equivalent, it's like a 50-50 between the external sector and the domestic debt, because we have had something like a 70% depreciation in the currency. So the foreign debt has significantly gone up in local currency terms. Now, if there is, and the domestic debt is at a much higher interest rate, so it's about maybe 70% of the interest cost is actually on domestic debt, the local currency debt, because there's some element of domestic debt that's issued in dollars also. So if you're going to do a restructuring of domestic debt, and this has come up in conversations, I mean, the banks are holding over 40%, the central bank is holding about 17%. So you talked about recapitalization of the central bank. Now, central banks are owned by the government. And the only person who can recapitalize the banks is the government, because I don't think there's going to be a lot of private capital in that highly distressed situation to recapitalize. So am I correct to say that it's such a circular issue that it really doesn't make sense for domestic debt to be restructured, because then the government will have to recapitalize the bank? So, you debit one side and you credit another side and you come back to square one. Is my thinking correct?
Correct.
So is inflation the way out then? How do you, already inflation this month is expected to go at 40%. You just inflate the problem away?
No, the inflation, it is not the solution. The solution is to be looking at the issues that they brought the country to this situation, and to take one by one the issues, and also trying, in order to be find politically feasible solutions. And the important thing also is to be having the public understanding the situation, why the country it came to this kind of a situation, and moving out from the situation, it is going to be entailing a lot of costs and also a lot of suffering. This is something that I believe that in every program, it is needed in order to have a good communication strategy. Explain to the public on a regular way, maybe through the press, maybe through the media, maybe through public relations roadshows, maybe through press releases, in order to be explaining the situation and to have it regularly. Because otherwise, the common person is not going to be understanding what the situation is. And you don't expect 100% of the population to understand, but the ones that they are making a difference and influencing others. So that's why a good communication policy, in order to understand why the country it has entered this kind of a difficult situation, what are the prospects of moving out of this situation, and what is needed, what are the strategies, and how these strategies they are related to their own well-being. That's very important in order to be getting an effective resolution out. This is what we have seen, that in cases that we have countries that they have communicated well with their public of what is needed and how much and in what kind of a frame period that this kind of a suffering it is going to be also needed. It has created better outcomes, better solutions, less uprisings, and also less hate to whoever you are going to be dealing with in order to be getting to the other situation. And as we have seen, because the IMF, it is always entering this situation, it is coming as the first scapegoat, and everybody it is blaming the IMF because it imposed this kind of measures. And governments, they have used it. But the IMF does not come to the country goes to the IMF. The IMF is, as you have pointed out, and in some of also the statements that we have heard from other commentators and other participants, the IMF is the hospital. The hospital does not go to the patient, the patients go to the hospital when they need the hospital. And sometimes the hospital, it administers medications that they are over and above the doses that they are needed. So that's why you need the reflection from the patient of how much of the medication you should take. And that's why we said that you need the local counterparts, a local, a strategy, some kind of a secretariat, some kind of an office that it is going to be addressing the situation where the country is, what is feasible, how it can be sustained going forward. I don't know if Tamon has something more to say, but that's my feeling.
Tamon, do you have anything to say? Yeah.
Yeah, so let me just, I think that Michael's point is totally correct. Let me just add the one additional point. So important thing is domestic debt restructuring is different from external debt restructuring in multiple perspectives, right? It has a consequence on domestic economy, what exactly the outcome in future, impact in the financial sector. What do you think about distribution between the banks and the non-banks and other sectors as well? So it has so many aspects to consider, as well as, inflating the debt is another method, but that has a consequence of the monetary policy credibilities. So that needs to take into account. So one additional point I would like to mention is my colleagues and myself have actually produced papers that has published in September 2021, which is actually issue for restructuring domestic debt. So this also lay out some of the issues that the policymakers needs to consider when restructuring domestic debt. So restructuring domestic debt is actually becoming one option for the policymakers, but at the same time, as Michael's mentioned, so many issues needs to be considered in advance, because the consequence of the domestic debt restructuring needs to take place. So that's actually that's what the policymakers needs to keep in mind. Those options, yeah. So that's it from my side, yeah.
There are some questions on growth. We may want to take that before we go to the concluding remarks. So the question was that how was Cyprus able to restore its growth in a relatively short period of time? You do mention in the article that the fact that if the impact, the wealth effect, if there was a loss of wealth to domestic depositors, then basically real consumption, etc., would have got impacted. But here, since most of the hit was taken by non-residents, perhaps the consumption side or the demand side would have been less impacted. But perhaps there were other factors. Would you like to comment on how Cyprus got back to its growth path? Because one of the key variables in debt to GDP is GDP growing faster than the debt stock. So go ahead, Tamon.
Yeah, so Michael might able to comment complement as well. So let me just do the first cut in Cyprus case. So the Cyprus case, what is really critical was reform was very efficiently implemented, right? So it restored the market sustainability. It actually regains external access. At the same time, it actually regained the credibility of the domestic market. So the authority can also tap the domestic market as well. So these are really crucial elements that all the reforms, particularly in financial sector restructuring happen at the same time, has been done in a very speedy manner. So that's ended up with a successful growth recovery happening on the 2014 and onwards. So you actually get market access. Speaking of the general domestic debt restructuring, when countries actually implement restructuring in a preemptive restructuring, which is ended up with the shorter durations and also without any kind of defaults, technical outlier defaults, countries' growth is actually substantially higher than those with a positive restructuring. So this is actually showing my joint work with Marco Chamon's and editors, which is published in our papers as well. So that's the recent paper that talk about. So that's general aspects that we have.
That's an important point. Did you say that countries that restructure before default manage to grow faster than countries that wait to default?
Correct. Yeah, if your country is actually ended up with a preemptive restructuring, which is not missing any of the payments, and actually restructure that without outlier default, then they tend to recover quickly, because that's actually showing my astronomical 2016. I'll be happy to send the papers. As a more detailed analysis, which you look at the astronomers at R 2021, one striking issue is going to be if the country is going to preempt the restructuring, technically even external debt restructuring, the impact on the investments and also bank credit is substantially lower. So that's actually the two drivers that will generate growth that comes back. So growth is actually resilience. The country start recovering relatively quickly. And also how long you spend in a debt restructuring also matters. So if you ended up with a quicker restructuring, even with the country's missed payments, they can recover quickly because they start doing recovery. But these issues has a lot of implication in terms of how we're going to design the program, as well as how we're going to implement, and how we do the fiscal consolidation, as well as other reforms as well. So all things, what matters, actually what they implement properly and very in a speedy manners, they can restore the growth in a very successful manner. Sorry, Michael might want to comment.
Before Michael comes in, I just want to inform the audience that in the case of Sri Lanka, there was about 11 or 12 investment banks and some other commentators since March 2020 were warning that Sri Lanka's debt was not a liquidity crisis, but a solvency crisis, and to have a preemptive restructuring. But our policymakers chose not to do that. And on the day that we suspended payment, our reserves were down to $5 million. And as Michael said right at the beginning, today is an important day, 18th of May, because it's 30 days after the coupon payment on 18th April. This was the end of the grace period. So technically, our default starts today, basically. So we moved into a hard default, although we had 2 years of warning to do a preemptive restructuring. And what Tamon says is that countries that do a preemptive restructuring recover much faster than countries that go into a hard default. Over to you, Michael. Do you have any further comments to make on this?
Yes, 2 points that I would like to make. You asked what is the current situation of the measures that they are needed in order to be moving faster in terms of growth, especially if you are in a situation of a restructuring and post-default. The first thing is, and the program, the IMF program, it is going to have enough of that, is to be looking at reform measures for increasing the productivity of certain sectors of the economy. As Tamon said, these have to be religiously followed. And also, your minister today, he talked about some of the money that they are going to come from the World Bank. They are 160 million in bridge financing from the World Bank. The World Bank, it is giving this kind of money with some kind of conditionality, that it is basically conditionality that it has to do with increasing the productivity. That's what it should be kept in mind of the politicians and the policymakers. Reforms that they are going to be increasing the total factor productivity of the economy. This is the only way in order to be raising the denominator of the debt to GDP ratio. That's the solution. Number two, the issues that they are coming forward in terms of domestic, external, yes, absolutely right with Tamon, that if you have a preemptive, not after default, a preemptive restructuring, always it has less costs for the economy. This, it has been the standard case, and yesterday I was in a forum with some credit rating agencies, and that it was stressed to the max. But how can you persuade politicians in order to be moving forward? That's the real question. And the case also of Sri Lanka, it's not unique. This is why we have said that we have the too little, too late issue. The politicians always, they think that it's a liquidity crisis. If we do this, if we do the other, then we are going to be overcome the storm, and we are not going to be needing in order to come to the situation that we are not, that the politicians, they cannot pay their debt obligations. There is always, and in most of the cases, wishful thinking of the politicians, and that's how they prolong this situation, and they end up into hard and also default kind of cases. Now, the important thing also here is to mention what Tamon said about a quick resolution as feasible, as quickly as feasible. And this, it has to do with a program that it needs from whatever kind of a design it is going to be decided between the authorities and the IMF, if it is going to be decided to be implemented and to be implemented as quickly as possible. That's a recipe in order to be regaining confidence from the markets, credibility from the markets, and new access. Now, an ingredient to that is that if, and of course it is going to be including a resolution of the external debt obligations, the important thing also is to take into consideration the feelings of the creditors. Because the creditors, they are going to be the ones that they are going to be giving new money, that you are going to be restoring market access. And that's how this is the next step after you're having the program with the country, in order to be coming, the country, in order to be coming into negotiations with creditors, in order to be having an efficient and effective resolution of the outstanding problems. Now, in this kind of a case, it comes also your comment, the earlier comment that you mentioned about the exit yield, because as you said correctly, that this it affects the net present value of the future returns of the new bonds. Now, it is an issue in most of the restructurings that we are having, that the discussion about the exit yields, it becomes a sticky point. Always try to be getting the creditors in order to be telling you ahead of time what they think, and based on these things that you are going to be coming in negotiations. Don't try to impose, the country should not try to impose the terms to creditors, because the simple reason is that you need to have the relief, so you need the consent from them, but also you need them for future financing. So you do not need, the country does not need to alienate the ones that you are going to be asking for financing in 6 months, a year, whatever it's going to be the time, in order to be having a restoration of some credibility of the creditors, that they are going to be coming back to the country. So, a general.
Michael, since we have been at this for quite some time, I would like you to, both of you, to say some concluding remarks, your advice to Sri Lanka, because we are going through an unprecedented crisis. You know, our citizens, basically some of the policymakers who were in charge, when they were asked, you know, why don't you restructure your debt? Their argument was that Sri Lanka never has defaulted on its debt, and that its citizens are resilient. But at the moment, some of our citizens may also not get even 3 square meals. And all this was done to just satisfy creditors. And we have continued to service our debt till we have virtually had no money left. So, Michael, we were speaking yesterday, and I said that Sri Lanka has gone to the IMF 16 times. I believe I think you mentioned that on 2 occasions, basically, you were involved in some kind of program with Sri Lanka. Was that correct?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Now, I know Pakistan has gone 21 times to the IMF, but 16 times is too many. And we would like the 17th time to be the last. So we have made the IMF always the boogeyman. We have chastised the IMF. But what should we do this time, that this is the last time that we ever go? You mentioned about the macroeconomic reform. You also mentioned to me about Turkey, that we hear about very high inflation in Turkey, but you said that, you know, some of the macro fundamentals include that debt to GDP is quite low at 40% the last time they went. So they did certain things quite correctly. What is your advice to us that this is 17th and the last time that we go?
I am going to be answering the question with what I am saying to my fellow Greeks when I am talking to them about the situation, both at the time that we had the program, but even right now. What is important, number one, is to be also cognizant of the fact that the situations that you said the 16 times, 17 times now, they are not created by themselves. They are created over time, and we should be careful, both as citizens and also as politicians, that they are elected by the citizens in order not to bring the situation, excuse me, to the extreme. Not having, number one, the tendency in order to be having the government giving, providing means that they do not have the means in order to do that by just borrowing. And citizens, they should not be asking from the government, because at the end, they are going to be suffering the consequence of that, either themselves or their children. So first, it is to be some responsibility, both from the government, but also from the citizens in how they are dealing with their elected officials. And the elected officials, they should not give in demands just in order to be likable or to get the next elections, number one. Number two is to have the government, whatever government is going to be there, that it is going to be looking on the real sector, on the real economy, to be looking, what we said yesterday, on how they are going to be increasing the base of the economy for production and for exports. And that's what we said a minute ago about the measures that they needed in order to be increasing the productivity. Find ways always in order to be thinking, if I am making this kind of expenditure, how is it going to be increasing my production capacity of the economy? How do I create jobs? How do I create also work for people that they are going to be coming later on? It is not only static for today, but it is for tomorrow, for the generations that they come. And also how you are going to be able as a country in order to be conquering the external market, how you are going to have exports. These are basic ingredients in terms of going forward with the number one factor that I think that is the most important factor, which is the growth of the real economy. And the third issue that it is coming is always having checks and balances, looking at the situation in all aspects of the economy. Both, we said about the fiscal, which is very important. It needs to be monitored. It needs to be having from the politicians on a consistent basis, a fiscal sustainability analysis, even though it is not needed in order to be going to the IMF. It is always needed when you are going to be having either domestic or external borrowing. That's very important. To always to have the temperature, to have your fever in order to know how much of a problem is for the economy if you are going to be borrowing an extra cent, an extra euro, an extra dollar, or whatever it is going to be the case. So the first issue of having a close monitoring, it is something that it needs to be on an institutional basis. You should be having an institution that is going to be constantly monitoring that. And along with that is that they are going, the government, it needs to be having a debt management system. And this is important. You cannot have 5 organizations dealing with the debt. Either it is government debt, or it is SOE, or it is guaranteed, or anything of the central bank that it needs to do with domestic issuances and everything else. You need one authority that it is going to be looking under the treasury of what is the debt situation. This is good practice, and countries that they have been going with this kind of reforms, they have been more successful than others in terms of dealing with their debt situations. And the final point is that when you have entered this kind of a situation, people, they need to know, and people, they need to have a lot of patience. This is not something that the suffering from this crisis that is going to go away within half a year or probably 2 years. Maybe it is going to be taken longer in terms of how much they are going to be suffering in terms of job losses, and also in terms of suffering with respect to taxes, and also with respect of how they are going to be managing their own affairs, especially at the current situation that we have too many external shocks. We have the external shock of the remnants of the pandemic. We have the problems of the inflation because of the high liquidity that it came after the pandemic. And we have also the implications of the war in Ukraine, that it has brought all of the food and the energy prices out of control. If you're going to be putting all these cascade shocks together, it makes the situation very difficult in order to be having also a default like the country is facing at the moment. So a lot of patience.
Thank you, Michael. Tamon, would you like to add anything?
Well, Michael put it very nicely, so there's not much to add. I mean, you know, there's so many countries has experiences, not only debt crisis, have a different type of crisis like POP and also like, you know, banking crisis. They have so many difficulties implementing reforms. The critical thing is going to be, you need to have implements reform, which is always, you know, countries' original reforms, which is necessary to come with, you know, different measures. So it's a challenging, but, you know, otherwise it's going to be difficult to have, you know, to get out from the crisis. Sometimes you need some IMF supported programs to be accompanied with. In some cases, not. It's always authorities reform agendas and to be in line with what's suggested by outsiders. So hope, you know, Sri Lanka experiences like, you know, the kind of a smooth recovery from the crisis, and will be successful in getting out from the crisis as well.
Thank you for that, Tamon. Finally, Michael, I mean, we are a finance association, chartered financial analysts in Sri Lanka. We have over 200 members. You know, we don't have any official position in government. You know, we have like a revolution going on in this country, and there's anti-politician feeling. You know, they have quite literally physically gone and attacked members of parliament. Is there a role in a crisis like this that people like ourselves who are supposed to be a little bit better informed, and you stressed on the fact of communication, you know, civil society organizations, do we have a role to play in the communication nexus?
My feeling is yes. And the way that I would approach it, we have not done in Greece, but, you know, I am always preaching that, is first of all, you are trying to communicate this and educate these things with the younger generation. So you're having all the candidates that they are coming for the CFA. A way also is in order to be having some conference and educate these young people of what is the situation. Secondly, you are very good at putting this kind of the overview of what are the situations. If you can have access to the universities and have these kind of presentations, I know that in my own country it is very difficult, but in Sri Lanka may be a little bit more easier in order to be getting in touch with the universities and also having these kind of situations in order to be educating the young generations. And the final thing is, if you can put some kind of press releases from your side. I do not know if it is feasible or not, but these would be ways in order to be having from your side whatever you can in order to be educating the people, and also having the people some kind of certainty, in quotes, in what it needs to be expected and how they should be going forward. The others, they say good luck. I don't say good luck. We making our luck. And that's how we should be looking forward. And from our case, Tamon and myself, I am sure, we are going to be always available in case that we are able, in order to be communicating something with you in any kind of a way. We are here in order to be helping the country, especially for myself, that my country has suffered for 10 years from this kind of a restructure and the default, and still it suffers from this kind of a case. So I'm always available if I can help in any kind of a way.
Thank you, Michael. I think Tamon had to log off
Yes.
because he had something else, and we are upon 2 hours. We should wrap today's session up. Michael, you have visited Sri Lanka.
Yes.
You have. When did you last come?
It was at 12.
12 years ago.
Yes.
Okay, so we hope going forward that we will have the pleasure of hosting you again in our country. On that
Thank you.
note, I would like to bring today's session to an end. We are just a few minutes below 2 hours. It's a long period. It's 8 o'clock in the night here. People would want to go and have their dinner. Dinesh, is there any final wrapping up on your side?
Not at the moment.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Then thank you very much once again, Michael. Thank you, Tamon. He had to leave. Thank you for the organizers and whoever the audience who has continued to listen. I hope that there are some takeaways. And as Michael said that, you know, we are elected representatives, are representatives, and we have to hold them accountable to how the country is governed. So on that note, I would say good night to everybody and goodbye.
And also goodbye from me, and thank you for the invitation. And all the best.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye now. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
People ask questions.
Yeah. It was one of the best